Welcome to FFP2510, Codes and Standards, Chapter 8, Inspection of Hazardous Materials. I want to start by giving a quick overview of the chapter objective. Objective number 1, identify the different federal regulations that manage hazardous materials in the workplace. The most significant ones include 1. Occupational Safety and Health Administration Hazardous Communication Standard, HCS. Number 2, the Environmental Protection Agency Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, RCRA. Number 3, OSHA Hazardous Waste Operations and Emergency Response, HAZWOPER. Number 4, Department of Transportation Hazardous Materials Regulations, HMR. Number 5, EPA Toxic Substance Control Act, TSCA. Number 6, EPA Clean Air Act, CAA. Number 7, EPA Clean Water Act, CWA. And number 8, EPA Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act, EPCRA. Objective number 3, identify the different hazardous materials classification systems used in facilities. The first one is the OSHA Hazardous Communication Standard, HCS. Number 2, the Globally Harmonized System of Classification and Labeling of Chemicals, GHS. Number 3, NFPA 704 Diamond. Number 4, DOT Hazard Classifications. Number 5, EPA Hazardous Waste Characteristics. Number 6, OSHA HAZWOPER Categories. The third objective is identify resources for determining the characteristics of hazardous materials. The first one is the Safety Data Sheets, SDS, formerly known as Material Safety Data Sheets, MSDS. Number 2, the chemical databases and websites. Number 3, regulatory agencies like OSHA, Occupational Safety and Health Administration, EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, and DOT, the Department of Transportation. Number 4, reference books and guides. Number 5, chemical manufacturers and suppliers. Number 6, professional organizations, similar to American Industrial Hygiene Association or the American Chemistry Society. Number 7, training programs and courses. By utilizing these resources, individuals and organizations can effectively determine the characteristics of hazardous materials. The fourth objective, review the major categories of hazardous materials and the inspection points necessary to prevent fires. The major categories of hazardous materials can vary depending on the classification system, but generally they include 1, flammable and combustible materials, 2, oxidizing agents, 3, corrosive materials, 4, toxic materials, 5, reactive materials. The inspection points include storage practices, handling and transfer procedures, ventilation systems, emergency response equipment, labeling and signage, and training and education programs. The final objective is to review the design alternatives permitted in building codes for the storage, handling, and use of hazardous materials. Building codes typically provide several alternatives for storage, handling, and use, and ensure safety and compliance with regulations. Some of these alternatives include segregation and separation, specialized storage cabinets and containers, secondary containment, ventilation systems, emergency response and evacuation plans, and training and education programs. In the late 70s, the public in the United States became aware of chemical hazards that were buried in different pieces of property. The Love Canal disaster led to the enactment of the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act, CERCLA, and was called the Superfund. The Love Canal area was originally the site of an abandoned canal that became a dumping ground for nearly 22,000 tons of chemicals, including polycarbonate biphenyls and pesticides. It was produced by the Hooker Chemical and Plastics Corporation in the 1940s and 50s. In the following years, the site was filled in and given by a company to the growing city of Niagara Falls, which allowed housing to be built on it. In 1978, however, the state officials detected leakage of chemicals from underground into the basements of homes in the area. The buried toxic chemicals seeped into the underground water and caused cancer. It was declared a waste site in 1978 by Jimmy Carter, and CERCLA or Superfund was established. The priority was to list the chemical sites requiring cleanup and provided funding and oversight through EPA. Chemical disasters of the 1980s led to new laws and regulation changes. Times Beach, Missouri, 1982, oil spread on roads to reduce dust came from a chemical company that produced Agent Orange, which caused cancer clusters and cost federal government $110 million to clean up. In Bhopal, India, 1984, the Union Carbide disaster, 18,000 people eventually died. The Institute in West Virginia, 1984, another Union Carbide disaster, only killed 134 people, considered a near miss. Congress was forced into action by these incidents, and a series of environmental protection laws were passed and signed by the President. The new laws included the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act, Title III, which was part of the 1986 Superfund Amendment and Reauthorization Act, or SARA. The Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, passed in 1976 to regulate solid and hazardous waste. It was a cradle-to-grave provision which tracked extremely hazardous chemicals, requiring that the chemicals be tracked from the day they were created until the day they were disposed of. The law requires extensive booking on these hazardous wastes and relegates many functions of the law to state governments and their departments of environmental protection. Regulation of underground storage tanks, or USTs, includes requirements for monitoring, double containment, release detection, spill control, and overfill of tanks. The law also regulates medical waste. SARA, or the Superfund Amendment Reauthorization Act, is a federal statute that requires EPA, when selecting a remedial action, to consider the standards and requirements in other environmental laws and regulations, and to include citizen participation in the decision-making process. LEPC, or Local Emergency Planning Committee, is a committee of local stakeholders established by SARA to plan and review information on facilities having reportable quantities of hazardous materials within the community. It was signed into law in 1986 by President Reagan, and it's one of the most important parts of the standalone regulation called Title III, the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act, or EPCRA, which mandated that each state form a State Emergency Response Commission and every municipality form a Local Emergency Planning Committee, or LEPC. The EPA regulates Section 312 for extremely hazardous substances, 356 chemicals, and hazardous substances, 720 chemicals, and Section 313 on extremely toxic chemicals, 650 chemicals. These chemical lists may be added to from time to time and can be found at the EPA website under the List of Lists. Members of the Local Emergency Planning Committee include elected officials, emergency management, fire, EMS, and police representatives, as well as public health and hospital officials, media, transportation, community groups, and owner-operators of facilities that are subject to hazardous materials regulations. Their roles have expanded since 9/11 and include additional management and planning to thwart potential terrorism. The basic roles are identify hazardous materials and facilities and transportation routes, identify emergency notification and response systems, designate emergency coordinators, identify local response equipment, establish community evacuation plans, and produce hazmat emergency plans and doing the training. The Workers' Right to Know standard, which is officially called the 29 Code of Federal Regulation 1910.1200, requires hazardous materials in the workplace to be labeled with a nationally recognized hazardous identification system. Common labeling systems are the NFPA 704 Standard System for Identification of Hazardous Materials for Emergency Response, the DOT Labeling System, and the Hazardous Materials Identification System, HMIS. Inspectors should request a copy of the Hazardous Materials Communication Plan because the code requires they maintain both a hazardous materials management plan and a hazardous materials inventory statement submitted under SARA on site. OSHA regulates the labeling of hazardous materials in the workplace. Employees must be trained in the safe handling of hazardous materials, and the law requires the use of personal protective equipment. And owners must maintain the material safety data sheet and hazardous materials communication plan at the facility. The Superfund Amendment Reauthorization Act, SARA, establishes quantities at which extremely hazardous or hazardous substances must be reported to the EPA. The threshold for extremely hazardous substances is the Threshold Planning Quantity, or TPQ. Hazardous substances have a TPQ of 1,000 to 10,000 pounds. Extremely hazardous substances have a TPQ of 500 pounds. Reportable quantities are the amounts of hazardous chemicals that once exceeded must be reported to the EPA under the rules of CERCLA. RQs, or reportable quantities, are adjusted to one of 5 levels: 1, 10, 100, 1,000, or 500 pounds of hazardous chemicals. Facilities that store, handle, or use hazardous chemicals identified on the list of lists report them to the local government, police, fire, and EMS responders if they exceed the law's threshold planning quantities. Tier 1 or Tier 2 reports must be submitted every March 1st to the CERC, the State Emergency Response Commission, the LEPC, the Local Emergency Planning Committee, and the local emergency responders. They must be kept in a fire inspection file and disseminated to firefighters, but not to the public. These reports will contain a list of all chemicals and hazardous substances required according to the TPQ or the RQ, the common chemical name, the chemical abstract service number, CAS number, the physical state, solid, liquid, or gas, the physical or health hazards, the immediate acute effects or delayed chronic effects, the inventory information, the maximum daily amount, the average daily amount, and the number of days on site. The storage information includes the container type, the pressure, the temperature, the specific information on storage amounts, and locations. The EPA's Emergency Response Program and Terrorism Response, or the E-Plan, is a collaborative effort between the EPA, the Department of Homeland Security, and the University of Texas to coordinate the EPA Tier 2 reporting nationwide in a database that is readily accessible to first responders, state, local, and federal officials. WISER is the wireless information system for emergency responders and is provided by the National Institute of Health. It has many useful tools to help identify hazardous chemicals, including the NFPA 704 placketing requirements for each specific chemical. Resources for hazardous materials incidents are maintained by the National Library of Medicine's Hazardous Substance Data Bank. The Department of Transportation labeling system is under 49 CFR 172-400 Code of Federal Regulations and is part of the North American Free Trade Agreement. It's followed by both Canada and Mexico. DOT labels are easily recognized by firefighters using the North American Emergency Response Guide that is provided free to responders by the Department of Transportation. DOT labeling is the most common for transportation of hazardous materials. It uses 9 hazard classes for placarding and labeling. The placards must appear on each bulk container and labels on each individual package. These must remain on the container until they are clean. This is the DOT hazard classification list. There are 9 major classifications and 23 overall. NFPA 704 placards, or the firefighter warning system, are designed to provide firefighters with basic information on hazards due to fire, health, or chemical reactivity when these materials are exposed to a fire, spill, or removed from their containers. The diamond-shaped placards with 4 quadrants, red, blue, yellow, or white, that each identifies a specific hazard rated 0 to 4 in each quadrant. Flammability is red, always at the top. Health risk is blue on the left. Chemical stability is yellow on the right. And the bottom quadrant is white and may be blank or may contain special information. The Hazardous Materials Identification System, HMIS, is very similar to NFPA 704. Major chemical manufacturers often use this system on bottled reagents, and it's designed more for laboratories. It uses colored bars, blue for health, red for fire, yellow for physical hazard, and white for personal protection. It uses numbers and letters to indicate level of chemical hazard. Letters identify the equipment necessary for protection. An A in the white bar indicates safety glasses, B indicates safety glasses and gloves, and C indicates safety glasses, gloves, and an apron. Material Safety Data Sheets, MSDS, are required for all hazardous chemicals found in the workplace by OSHA Hazardous Communication Act, SARA, and Title III. They provide better information than labels. It's a technical bulletin prepared by the manufacturer in accordance with provisions of 29 Code of Federal Regulations 1910-1200 to provide workers with detailed information about the properties of a commercial substance containing hazardous materials. It provides the chemical name, the common synonyms, the manufacturer's information, physical and chemical properties, health risk, exposure factors, firefighting methods, environmental considerations, and safety concerns for handling the chemical. It can be useful in determining the types of chemical storage present for the compatibility in physical and health hazards. Key components are the physical and health hazards of the chemical, which assists fire inspectors in identifying the correct hazardous materials exempt amount table to use in the fire code. It must be maintained in an approved location and reviewed during the annual inspection. Since Fire Prevention Code is a maintenance code, and the maintenance code applies to the entire property, including outdoor storage, it will cover more detail about storage, handling, and use of hazardous materials than the building code does. To determine whether a change of building code has occurred, a fire inspector must consider the building code alternatives related to the hazardous material. The step-by-step method may help. One relevant key term is exempt amounts. The permitted amounts of a hazardous material requiring approval allowed for storage, handling, and use within a controlled area. Quantities that exceed the exempt amounts shall be placed in a group H, high hazard. Step 1. The inspector should determine the types of hazardous materials present and divide them into 3 material groups. The materials with physical hazards, materials with health hazards, and finally materials that have both physical and health hazards. Step 2. The fire inspector should take the 3 lists of materials and determine the quantity of each hazardous material that is present in the building and its locations. Step 3. The fire inspector should now divide each list into the hazardous materials that are solid, those that are liquid, and those that are gases. Step 4. The fire inspector should determine on each list which hazardous materials are in storage, which are used in open systems, and which are used in closed systems. Step 5. Evaluate each area where the hazardous materials are stored, handled, or used, and answer the following questions. 1. Is the area enclosed in a fire-resistant rate construction complying with code requirements for the control area? 2. Is the use or storage area inside or outside the building or in a separate building? 3. Is the indoor area protected by an automatic sprinkler system? 4. On what floor is the control area located within the building? 5. Are the hazardous materials kept in code-compliant storage cabinets? 6. Does the area have proper ventilation and safeguards for spill control and spill containment? Step 6. Take each list of hazardous materials and determine the permitted exempt amounts for each hazardous materials based on the information you have gathered. Keep in mind the following key points. All hazardous materials must be stored, handled, or used in a control area. Approved listed storage cabinets will allow a 100% increase in the permitted exempt amount on the table, and automatic sprinkler protection will allow the same 100% increase. The permitted exempt amount of hazardous materials in the table applies only to the first floor of the building and will decrease by a specific percentage if the control area is on the upper floor.